My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today, we have an amazing guest, Susan Wan Darling. She's a Hong Kong American poet translator extraordinaire. But before we get to that great interview, I wanted to let you know that my book, China's Backstory, The History Beijing Doesn't Want You to Read, it is out now today, Monday, December 1st, the day this podcast is being released. I got an email this week before American Thanksgiving. My publisher had a copy of the book in his hands. I am still personally waiting to touch a copy of it. It's being shipped right now. My parents actually got their copies delivered to them. I've seen the photographs. The books are out there in the wild. Some of y'all who pre-ordered, you should have your copy now. Others of y'all are still probably waiting and will get the order soon. My copy is supposed to come Friday, so hopefully yours won't be too long. If you have not already purchased a copy, you can go to my publisher's website, Unsung Voices Books. I'll put a link to that purchase page on the book's website, chinasbackstory.com. Or you can go to the podcast website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. There's a link there that will take you straight to Unsung Voices Books website. I just checked today. You can now also buy the book on Amazon. So you can get it either on Amazon or my publisher's site. If you get it from my publisher's site, I get a bit more of the cut. And of course, my publisher also gets a bit more of the cut. If you buy it from Amazon, that cut goes to Jeff Bezos. I think he's trying to buy another yacht. So either way, it's a good cause. I know a lot of people prefer to buy on Amazon. I get it. It's easier. However you buy the book, I really appreciate you buying it. My publisher just asked me to mention all of that whenever I promote the book. So I'm trying to do that. Okay, that's enough about billionaires and my book. Let's get to fun stuff. That is Tang and Song Dynasty poetry. You've read her translations of Chinese poetry in books like her series, My China in Tang Poetry, or her most recent book, What the Cuckoo Says. Now you are about to hear her in her own words. Poet, novelist, scholar, and translator Susan Wan Darling. Here is that interview. My name is Lee Moore. This is the Chinese Literature Podcast. We have another special guest on today's show, Susan Wan Darling. Susan Wan Darling is a Chinese-American poet, novelist, translator, scholar, amongst other things. Susan was born in Hong Kong. She got her bachelor's in English and creative writing and her PhD in comparative literature, all from Princeton University. She's taught at Fordham University and at the University of Texas in Austin, Texas, where she currently resides. She has published 5 books with Earnshaw, a Hong Kong-based publisher that focuses on China and Asia more broadly. So she has one series on Tang poetry. It's called My China in Tang Poetry. Volume 1 is called Superstars. Volume 2 is Floating on Clouds. And volume 3 is Friends and Lovers. She has a Song Dynasty poet series. That's volume 1 is 100 Tongues. And the most recent book that she has published, just What the Cuckoo Said, that's volume 2 of the Song Dynasty Poets series. Susan, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Susan, would you mind explaining the titles of your books from the Song Dynasty series? There's 100 Tongues and the other one is
What the Cuckoo Said. 100 Tongues is what the Chinese call the bull-headed shrike, because, like the mockingbird, it is a great imitator and sings a variety of songs. I have borrowed its name for my poets, because they sing a variety of songs. That's one of my purposes of choosing these particular poets in the series, because I want to show the really vast differences between, among the poets. Now, the second volume is called What the Cuckoo Said, because to the Chinese ear, the cuckoo song sounds like 不如归去 or 不如归去, like that, which may be translated as, why don't you go home? Might as well go home, or simply go home now. Its song is particularly painful for the Southern Song poet to hear, because by this time the Jurchen tribe has taken over the northern half of the Song territory, which most of them regard as home. So there's a lot of, longing for home, a lot of bird songs in song poetry.
You grew up in Hong Kong and you moved to the US. What about song and Tang poetry still captures you?
I went to school in Hong Kong, so everybody studied popular, if you will, classical Chinese poetry from those two periods. When I was growing up, Hong Kong was still a British colony, and I went to a British school, and so I didn't really take it very seriously. But my mother was a scholar, not professionally, but she really loved Chinese literature, and she's always like chanting things. Chinese people, when they read poetry, they kind of chant it. So I heard a lot of poetry, even though I didn't take it seriously. So that's kind of sunk in. And then I had a Irish teacher at my school who did what we used to call verse speaking. And she taught me to read English poetry in a way that only people who love poetry read English poetry that way, sort of phrasing it and speaking it orally. To me, poetry is an oral experience. And so anyway, then in between, I was in Japan for a few years. When I came to America, in Princeton just started a translation workshop. And I was in the poetry workshop of this poet, John Peck, who started the translation workshop. And he very kindly came to me and said, you might want to try this because like Ezra Pound's poetry became great with the translations. And it's like great praise. He presented it as an exercise. But once I started doing it, though, I realized that this stuff was in me. I did research, of course. Classical poetry, as you know, is not easy to read, but it brought me home in a way that I never felt home in, because I moved about so much, and Hong Kong was a colony, and I was rather rootless. And so translation was for me a going back to my roots kind of experience. Although, again, I was not studying Chinese per se. I was in comparative literature, but my thesis was only half on Du Fu and half on W.B. Yeats, actually. And so I did more English poetry than I did Chinese poetry at the time. But then, of course, this stuff stayed with me, and I kept translating, even though I wasn't professionally teaching Chinese at the time. I was teaching romantic poetry, of all things, at Fordham. And then many years passed, lots of stuff accumulated. Although I was not very good about publishing them, I only had bits and pieces here and there. It wasn't until, I guess, about 7 years ago now that I started. It was in the process of writing my mother's memoir that I started putting together this whole lot of stuff I have on Tang and Song, because it was so close to my mother. I hear her chanting sometimes as I read the poetry. So I started putting it together, and very, very fortunately, I found Earnshaw, Graham Earnshaw is the founder and owner of Earnshaw Books. And he really appreciated what I was trying to do, which is in a scholarly but non-academic way, try to make Tang and Song poetry accessible to not just Chinese readers modern readers who don't necessarily read classical poetry, but to English readers and to people who have no way of understanding or reaching or accessing this poetry. So that's why I called it My China in Tang poetry. And it's because my approach is really quite personal, in that this is how I found China in a way, because I grew up really not knowing China, growing up with a Chinese population and speaking Cantonese, of all things, and Cantonese being a closer dialect to, apparently, according to linguists, the classical Chinese that was spoken. I heard the music. I heard the music through my mom and through my dialect. And I've always felt that English translations of Chinese poetry doesn't bring over the music that I hear. I mean, they bring over, visually. Pound did a lot of work on that, the images and all that. The meaning, of course, scholars, sinologists have much, much better credential than I to the scholarship. I thought I had something to contribute. So that's how it came about.
I'm intrigued by this idea of music. What is the music that you see you bringing to these translations that other translators before you haven't brought?
I'm maybe too arrogant in claiming that.
No, I think you're right.
People who know classical Chinese poetry who tell me when they read my poetry, my translations, which I claim as my poetry, that they can hear the Chinese poem in my English. Now, I don't know. I'm not a linguist. I don't myself analyze this stuff. So it's from people like, well, no, I don't want to quote him since he can't answer back since he's no longer with us. But anyway, people who study classical Chinese for a long time or who know this poetry for a long time seem to hear the Chinese in my English. When I say music, I'm really talking about the music of the translations. There's no scheme, there's no pattern that I follow deliberately. Maybe what I'm trying to say is that a lot of translated poetry sounds translated. In other words, they don't sound natural. They don't sound as... To me, Chinese poetry is not this esoteric, philosophical. It's personal. It's everyday. It's ironic because a lot of people talk about Chinese poetry, classical poetry, having no I in the poems. But in fact, every one of them is an I. If they're speaking their mind, they're speaking, it's always an occasional poem. It's personal.
是言志, right? 是言志,
Yeah,
right? The classic.
Yes, it's my motto.
是言志, we're using this Chinese phrase that means the poem speaks one's intent. The poem expresses one's intent. The volume you just published is on the Southern Song, and in it you talk about the evolution of the Ci poem. You were discussing this concept of translation and how, and I think it's a fair claim you make, you bring this music or musicality to translations, English translations of Chinese poems that other translations don't have. I totally see what you're saying. I actually just published China's Backstory, a book where I did some translations of Chinese poetry. And one of the things I complain about is whenever Western academics translate Chinese into English, it sounds something in between Shakespeare and Victorian England, like Charles Dickens or something. They're trying to make it sound highfalutin. I like your translations because they don't do that. They sound, is natural a fair word to use?
Yeah, thank you.
One thing we're going to have to address, we keep throwing around these technical Chinese terms for different types of poetry, 诗 and 词. Can you explain the difference between 诗 and 词?
The 诗 is think of it as a sort of a rectangle. It's either 5 character or 7 character, usually 8-line verse. So it's like, all the lines are the same length. The 词 is a later form. Well, not really a later form because it's been there for a while, but it came into really vogue, one might say, in the Song Dynasty. And in the Tang Dynasty already, some people were starting to write it. It started off as songs from the north, I think, well, from the west, and Persia, that is, not that far west. And so it was like popular songs. But then the poets started writing the lyrics to the songs, and then they formalized it into patterns. And those are called 词. And sometimes are called long and short lines. So the easiest way to distinguish between a and a is that the has long and short lines, and the are all the same line lengths.
Yeah, it totally does. And I should just point out for the listener who is not familiar with Mandarin, shi is spelled S-H-I. The book that you just wrote and the translations you did in that book, the ci are originally, we translate them as lyrics in English, and ci poetry. But
Yeah.
they started out in as actual music. They were usually accompanied by music, and then they become a more literary over the centuries. They become more literary. When you're translating what you're calling music, is that at play in this most recent volume?
Well, I wouldn't say that simply because, in the Tang poetry, the shi, they didn't start off as music, as songs, as the ci lyrics started off as songs. But then by the time, even in the Song dynasty already, they're not normally sung as such. There's no music to go with it because the music is lost. So what they do, they fill in the pattern, the tonal pattern of the ci. So it's already not a musical experience in the sense that it's not sung.
When we were talking about doing this podcast, I asked you a big question and you gave me a very diplomatic answer. I'm going to ask it just because it's something that's intrigued me. So there's a debate, which dynasty has the best poetry, Tang or Song? Textbook answer is always Tang. I am not so sure of that. You gave an even better answer.
I forget what I said. I forget. I don't remember what I said, but I mean, generally, I approach poetry pretty much. I don't approach it like I can't say that I can't really talk about a period or even one poet's poetry because it's so varied. In fact, the song series, especially, what I try to do in my selection of poets is to show the variety. Some are so lyrical and others are so warrior-like even in some ways. It's a very despite having been in comparative literature, it's really hard to compare one genre to another. The shi is the genre that became ultimately best, very well developed in the Tang Dynasty and the ci and the Song. So they're completely different animals, I think, the ci and the ci. So I still can't answer that question, which is better, because the better ci's are better, the better shi's are better, So.
Do you have a poet that you think is the greatest?
I love Xi Qiji, the last poet in What the Cuckoo Said. And I surprised myself at falling in love with him because he's a warrior, but a very romantic warrior, a very humorous warrior. When he's very, very serious, in fact, when he's very, very serious, I appreciate him less. But when he's making fun or when he writes some really romantic stuff, I imagine him to be a very interesting person too. So I love his poetry, most of his poetry.
Susan, would you mind reading us his poem?
Yeah, I'd love to. Usually these poems don't have titles. They only have the tune titles, but I give them titles. So this one is called Making Noise by Xi Jiji. Lost in the misty, dewy wilderness of willows by the pond, after the rain, when the sun comes out, sun burning through the rain, so bright it reveals in a gush of spring wind the many hues of green. Popbirds and noisy cuckoos calling, urging me to go home, rousing a million strands of regret, a million memories and yearnings. We each have our own pointless reasons for making noise.
Such a beautiful poem.
Yes, and lots of repetitions. This is the form. In Chinese, it's like exact repetitions, but I couldn't do that in English. It just didn't make, you know, it's just doesn't sound as nice as the Chinese. Of course, Li Bai, Du Fu, you can't not love their poetry. Just because, well, Li Bai, his personality is difficult to resist. Du Fu is his seriousness. I mean, I have the portrait of Du Fu hanging on my fireplace, on top of my fireplace.
Oh,
Um, because he's just such a hero. I mean, and the how he lived through his time and what he wrote about it, of course. I mean, it's just so admirable. I often turn to him and say, "How the hell did you do it?" It's just how do you even live through that kind of torment?
I love the phrase that you just used. I often turn to him. It helps me make sense of your series title, My China in Tang Poetry.
Yeah.
It speaks to how these poets are still speaking to us. Du Fu, Li Bai, they died 1300, 1400 years ago, a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that fascinates me with Chinese literature is I don't know of many other traditions where you have poets speaking to people this far back so consistently. If you think about like the Western tradition, you've got Dante, but it's hard to find other people before Dante who speak with that same strength of voice carrying over the centuries.
As I say in my introduction to the song poetry, the poets really in their poetry is saying, "This is who I am." They're very personal to me. I feel like that has been misunderstood about Chinese poetry. How impersonal Chinese poetry seems to be if you just read English translations of them, or even the very best translations of them. But in fact, they are so very personal that they read like diaries to me.
It's easy if you read these other translations of Chinese poets where they are scrupulously keeping that pronoun I out of them
Yes,
that you can think it's very impersonal, but and I mean there's a reason that those translations are done that way, but I like the way you do it because the I is assumed, right? Like you don't because
that's right. Yes,
because the poem speaks your intentions, your feelings. You don't have to say I. Classical Chinese, even outside of poetry, you tend to not see I that much, the pronoun I, but it's assumed. You don't have to say it in classical Chinese poetry. Whereas like in a history, like it's assumed that it's not there. But because because the poem speaks the intent, it
yeah.
it it should be translated in there, right?
And also, it gives you room to enter into it. You can assume the I when you are reading it. So that's very personal.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, so the translation that you most recently published, What the Cuckoo Said. So you start out with Li Qingzhao.
Yes.
So Li Qingzhao is this incredible female poet figure. She, like Du Fu, spans this dynastic near collapse. I've heard people say Li Qingzhao has gotten not enough press, not enough attention from poets because she is a female. And I've heard some people suggest that she stands equal to Du Fu. And I've heard some people say that's going too far. What do you think?
You can't stand anywhere near two.
Okay.
Nobody can. No, she has been called the best lyricist. Okay, so her cis are supposed to be the best. I tend to shy away from these kinds of hierarchical judgments of poets and poems. It's very good, but a lot of it is lost, and even the ones we have, even the ones I have included in what the Cuckoo said. One scholarly friend of mine said recently that he's not crazy about all of them because some of them really aren't, they don't sound like her, he says. I don't know what that means, but I like her humor. I think she's very witty, and she's very daring for her times. I think what was sort of in dispute, sort of controversial, is at the later part of her life, after her husband died, and she was not done, as it were, she married again. She married a nasty man, apparently, and she wanted out of the marriage. But of course, it's unheard of. But she was lucky enough to find corruption that he had committed. I don't know if it's felony, but some kind of corruption. And she was able to take him to court and say, this guy is corrupt. And because of that, she was able to divorce him. Now, later, Neo-Confucian scholars who really liked her work, but wanted her to be this pristine Confucian woman who, this being divorced and having married again, this is sort of unspeakable evil for a woman. They wanted to deny that fact. They wanted to say, no, this never happened. And in that way, we could say that they were not being fair to her life, to her poetry. But in terms of the work itself, the poems themselves, I hear very little sort of disagreement about how wonderful they are. Most of them, anyway. Not maybe some of the ones that was questioned by my friend were not as great, but there are some really great ones.
The Song Dynasty is when foot binding started. So there's almost this sense with Li Qingzhao that the reaction against her and the reaction of the Neo-Confucians against feminism is like they're trying to literally and metaphorically bind Li Qingzhao into this very specific kind of womanhood. I think that Tang, they wouldn't care.
Yes, Tang is much freer. There are 4 women, they call them the 4 great female talents in the Tang Dynasty in volume 2. A nun, a courtesan, I think the other, well, a combination nun courtesan, and then a singer. There's some pretty saucy poems mixed in, quite amazing. Not what one would expect.
In What the Cuckoo Said, you have a poet who's not known really for his poetry, Yue Fei, who is, I mean, all Chinese, I mean, to engage in intellectual discourse means you have to be able to write a poem. So everyone in Chinese history pretty much can write a passable poem. Yue Fei wrote some poetry, but he's much more known as a warrior, and you talk about him some in the book. You mentioned that, so Yue Fei is fighting against these barbarians in the north. The Song Dynasty collapses. They retreat south. Yue Fei is trying to recover that. He has an arch nemesis, Qin. So his name is sometimes pronounced Qin Hui, Qin Kuai, and you go with Qin Gui because that character can be pronounced sometimes, and there's a homophone pun with that name that you talk about. Yue Fei is this important figure whose poetry is not his main contribution to Chinese history. Did you see his poetry as particularly good? And also, can you discuss, so this is actually like 3 or 4 questions, sorry. Sometimes it happens that way. Could you discuss the controversy over whether or not Yue Fei actually wrote these poems? Because there are some questions as to that, right?
Yes. There is that question. And I'm sorry, I can't give you any, yes or no answers.
If podcast only had yes or no answers, they would be quite boring. So do not apologize. This is great.
You might notice the way I organize the two books, the first volume and the second, is that each book has in the second chapter a chapter that is not just poetry. In 100 Tongues, the chapter was about history, song history, a very short history. And then in What the Cuckoo Said, the second chapter is Yue Fei. And because Yue Fei is such an important cultural figure, it's almost a myth. I grew up as a child even being taught how his mother tattooed those 4 words on his back.
And just to butt in here again, Yue Fei had a tattoo, 精忠报国, which roughly translates as with endless loyalty, repay the country or serve the country.
I mean, you look at the whole long arc of Chinese history. In fact, China had been overtaken by outsiders, if you will, non-Chinese, non-Han people, several times in its history. And they come in and they take over China and they almost become Chinese. They use the Chinese system, the Yuan dynasty, the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty in China. It's a foreign, if you will, ruler. This is very strong sense culturally of outsiders and Chinese people. And Song Dynasty, the second half, is when the Jurchens from the Northwest, I think. My geography is not that great.
Northeast.
Northeast, okay. I accept it. Whatever. Anyway, took over almost half of China. So the the national feelings are very strong against what they call barbarians. Xiongnu, the ones that in your face poem, he's drinking their blood. So he's that figure. He's a cultural, national, patriotic figure. The poem was really difficult to translate. The first few lines where his hair's bursting out of his helmet. Anyway, it's very, very famous poem. Everybody knows that poem.
The name of the poem is Blood Red, the Raging River, Manjiang Hong.
Mm-hmm. Shall I read it to you?
Would you?
Of course. Blood Red, the Raging River. And it's usually called Full River Red, Manjiang Hong, to the tune of Full River Red. With rage bursting through my helmet, I stand on the terrace, bristling. The rain is subsiding. I look to heaven, howling at the gods. My heart hardly able to contain its wrath. 30 triumphant years turned to dust and ashes, 80,000 leagues of conquests, clouds and moons. I have not dared to rest. This youthful head turned white in an instant, this vacant despair. The shame of Jinkang, yet unavenged, our dashed hope, yet unrevived. I could chase these bandits back to the Helan Pass in my swift chariot, make a meal of their Hulu bodies, gladly drink their Xiongnu blood to quench my thirst. Starting again from scratch, I'll retrieve our country's lost mountains and rivers and bring them back under heaven. He was not allowed. See, he was very successful in chasing them back, and then he was pulled back by this villain, we call him. And so he was not allowed to do what he knew he could do, or he thought he could do. That's this poem. And then there was a movie very recently in China that was very, very popular based on his story.
You're talking about the 2023 film, and it's just the exact same as the title of the poem, Manjiang Hong, Full River Red. That's kind of plays off of that story. I haven't seen it. I have you. You haven't.
I've only heard anecdotes of how people would stand up on the chairs and, clap and go crazy at the end of the movie. That's how much people really worship, I would say, UFA.
I told you I was going to ask this question. Is that second stanza seems racist. It's quite graphic. Make meals out of their Hulu bodies, gladly drink their Xiongnu blood to quench my thirst. First off, so Xiongnu is a term that refers to an ethnic group in what we today call Mongolia. They had an encounter with the Han dynasty, the defining other for the Han dynasty. But that was more than 1,000 years before Yue Fei was born. By using this old name to refer to these people, I always feel like, I mean, and he's not the only one who does that. Lots of songwriters actually use the term "shongnu" to refer to
anybody
yeah, to
outside.
any hairy barbarians who are riding horses up in the lands north of China, because they're all the same, pretty much.
Yeah.
There's this kind of baked-in racism in the song that really comes out in Yue Fei. At least that's how I interpret it.
Yeah. No, you're right. They're obviously the hawks and the doves in the Song Dynasty as well as any other period of any history. If you were a hawk, and in this case, the hawks are supposedly the good guys because they are the ones who want to take back what belongs to them. So anybody who is non-Han, who are the tribes outside of China trying to invade China would be called, yes, barbarians, Xiongnu. Of course they're racist.
And of course, it's fine to, I think it's fine for us to sitting here in 2025 criticize Song Dynasty racism. It's not like the Chinese were the only people engaging, the Song were the only people engaging in racism in 1100 or 12. Everybody was doing.
Yeah.
I had never heard of the poet Zhu Shuzhen until you mentioned her. Her record has, I mean, she's been downplayed in Chinese poetry to the point where we're not even 100% sure we know her actual name. You talk about that in your introduction to her. Could you explain her importance and also explain why she is so important?
Well, maybe not to everyone. I think her poetry, some of them are as good as a lot of the men's, but even her parents burned her poetry because she was considered a fallen woman. Of course, I think she ought to get more notice. And as more and more people are appreciating her stuff, but a lot of it is lost because they burnt it. But there are some really good ones, I think. I wanted to give her voice. And, so she is not as well known as Li Qingzhao.
Could you explain what you mean by fallen woman?
Oh, well, she had relationships with men outside of marriage. Apparently, maybe even before she was married, and certainly after, because in her poetry you find a couple of poems where she talks about that she's having these affairs. But we don't know why, because she was also born into a established, shall we say, family. Xingzhao was born into an intellectual family, but somehow they married her off to somebody who was totally unsuitable, who did not appreciate her, and so it didn't work. And he left her. So she was an abandoned woman. That, of course, is her fault, according to her society. And then she had the gall to go out and have other relationships. So that, of course, makes her a fallen woman.
You compared her to Li Qingzhao. And I mean, one way when you're describing her that I think she's very different is Li Qingzhao had a pretty good marriage, at least initially.
Wonderful marriage.
Right?
Enviable marriage.
Right. In the end, it didn't go well, but it was more of it was caught up in geopolitics. Could you explain Li Qingzhao's marriage a bit?
They had very similar tastes, and they had this collection of old stuff that they, antique, and they collected together and compiled books together, and they wrote poetry to each other, and they were very well matched. Even though their families also apparently were on different sides of political issues. So then when the chaos of war broke out, her husband was sent all over the place, and so they were separated a lot. And he actually left the North before she did, because his mother had run to the South with the court, or was it even before? Yeah, with the Song court when the Jurgens invaded. So she was left alone with all their stuff. She had to transport all this collection and as much of their belongings as she could all by herself, without
in
her
the
husband.
Face of an invasion, a barbarian invasion bearing down on her, right?
Right. Ron Egan, who is the authority on her, who wrote lots of books on her, said that she was very resentful during this period of him having left her all by herself to fend for herself and also to take care of their belongings to go to the south. And then he died, and so she was truly left all to her own devices.
And that's when she got into that bad abusive marriage
Right.
and eventually
Right.
got out of it. You've done 2 volumes in the Song Dynasty series. Is there going to be any more, or is it going to just be a 2-volume series?
It's 2 volumes for now. In fact, we've talked mostly about the women in the Song Dynasty, then they're mostly populated by men. And in fact, there were quite a lot of surprises for me in the Song Dynasty when I was working on these poets. Not the least of whom was this poet called Lu You, who is in the 2nd volume, in What the Cuckoo Said. And he's quite a character. I mean, they're all amazing characters.
I was going to ask, who were the poets in the volume 1? I assume, I know you talked about Sudong Po. Who
Yes,
else?
in volume 1. The poets in volume 1, the first one is really not a song poet, but he came just before the song, and his little kingdom, Li Yu, was swallowed by the song. So he came first as a sort of transitional poet, and his cis were so influential that anyone who wrote a cis after him would have been influenced by him. So that's why he came. He came as the first poet in the first volume. And then we have that little chapter on the history of song. And then we come to another patriotic poet called Fan Zhongyan. Then we have a popular songwriter called Liu Yong. He's very controversial because he wrote a lot of rather sexy poems. And then there's Mei Yaochen, who is very, very different from his friend Ouyang Xiu. But these are the 2 pairs of friends come at the end of the first volume. One is Mei Yaochen, Ouyang Xiu, and then Sushi. And
I want to point out something. So for longtime listeners of the podcast, Mei Yaochen wrote a poem to his dead cat, I believe, offering a sacrifice to my cat, which we did a podcast on years ago. Yeah.
It's in here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Louis also had some cat poems that are really funny and interesting, and he's in volume 2. Then the cat poems are there.
So that's reason enough right there to go out and buy it, which I should mention. The book is available. It's from Earnshaw Books. You can buy it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or you can go directly to Earnshaw Books itself. Earnshaw Books publishes on topics that I think don't get enough attention from the big publishers. So it's a great source. I'd suggest looking around their catalog, see if you can find something interesting. Pick up What the Cuckoo Said while you're there, 100 tongues to go just to make the set complete, or at least it's as complete as it is now. And also, Susan, your website is susanwandolling.com. So that's SUSANWANDOLLING.com. Is that right?
Yep, that's it.
They can find more information about you and your works. Also, I wanted to mention before we go, you're doing a series note after note on YouTube.
Yes. Me and my cello teacher. I took up cello a year ago, so I'm not very good, but I love cello music, and you'll find it on the podcast where I explain how we came about forming this duo, because I have all these poems I want to perform. I kind of an excuse for me to perform the poem with the music, and she loves the poems as well. So we're doing thematic presentations.
If I could say, it's a thing that someone with a PhD in comparative literature would come up with, because you combined music with literature, two arts that aren't normally combined, but there they are, and they go quite well together. I'll put a link to that on the website where I will publish this podcast. So if you want to go take a look at that, it's Note After Note. You can find it on YouTube, or you can go to ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com, find the interview with Susan, and I'll have the link to that on the webpage there.
Wonderful.
Susan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been great having you here.
Thank you. It's been fun.
I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.